Why is it that in modern times we have decided that anything that our ancient ancestors have recorded or claimed to have happened or whatever, why is it that we in modern times completely ignore what they have to say? I mean, why is this? Why is it that we find that there are records of our past? All cultures have it to some degree or another, right? Everybody's got something. Whether it be written down, chiseled into stone, oral, whatever, it doesn't matter. Everybody has some kind of a history that was attempted to be brought down throughout the generations. Why is it that right now in modern times we completely ignore all of it? I mean, think about it. Think about how the mainstream right now approaches history, or how the mainstream handles all of these histories that our ancestors did their best to transfer on down the ages, right? Mainstream history completely ignores them. I mean, and they ignore all of them. It's not like they kind of pick and choose. Okay, well, maybe there's a little bit of pick and choosing, which is already bad enough. But the reality is, what do? They completely categorize the bulk of everybody's histories as essentially fictional. Or, maybe half truth, maybe, or embellished, or whatever, right? Mainstream historians never look at our ancestors' histories and say, hey, look, you know what, you guys? Let's just take this at face value and let's go from there. Let's listen to what our ancestors say. Because, I mean, they were there, right? I mean, if you're a historian, your entire job is to try to figure out what the hell happened in the past. And when you have your own ancestors telling you what happened in the past, right? I mean, orally, written, it doesn't matter. They attempted to do this, and then historians just throw all that stuff in the garbage. I mean, what kind of disrespectful garbage is this? Right? And this is literally how the mainstream historian approaches their work with respect to history. Now, it doesn't take a genius to realize that that is a unbelievably corrupt and messed up way of approaching really any subject, but we're going to stay focused on history here. But I mean, think about that. Think about how insane that is, right? If you're a historian, you're trying to figure out what happened in the past, and you have been given all of these histories from all of these cultures. And the first thing that a mainstream historian does is they crumple that stuff up and throw it in the garbage. Or they file it away as a fiction. I mean, what is this? And they don't even try. They don't make a single effort to try and substantiate any of the claims that our ancestors are making. I mean, this is disrespectful on just an ungodly level, right? I mean, okay, but why is this? Why do we find a situation in modern times to where mainstream historians are so quick to dismiss all of this stuff that our ancestors have attempted to transmit? Like, why? Where the hell did this attitude even come from? Now, I'm only going to speak from a Western psychological perspective, because I don't live in a non-Western country, right? But I mean, the reality is, are there even places on this planet nowadays that can escape the westernized version of society? Right? I don't think so. That the Western version of culture is basically spreading everywhere. As the internet spreads to, the Sahara and every little nook and cranny on this planet, Western ideologies are being pumped directly into the inhabitants of those areas. And if those inhabitants, don't know any better, they're being corrupted right from the get-go. Anyway, even just thinking about it, just thinking about what the mainstream is trying to do. And by the mainstream, I guess what I really mean is the people at the top, right? What these people are doing is they are infesting the world with this corrupt ideology, and it's working. And that's the worst part about the whole thing, right? Everybody in the West is already essentially done. If you exist right now, like it or not, the reality is you have a huge amount of psychological programming that has been installed in your psyche. And if right now you're like, no, I don't, there's no way, I'm too smart for that. No. If you're a human, You are programmable. There is no way around this, right? If you are a human being, you are physically and mentally, essentially, it seems like, designed to be able to be programmed. How do you like that? Now that's a whole other topic and subject. And I don't believe in God. I'm not a young earth creationist and all that crap, but it's funny when you look at the science like that, right? Because I mean, as a side note really fast, I mean, why is it that humans can be essentially psychologically controlled? I mean, what kind of evolutionary feature is that, right? I mean, if you believe in evolution, I don't think I've ever heard anybody give me an explanation as to why humans would have evolved with the innate capability to be taken advantage of by other humans, or, I mean, really anything that can manipulate psychology. I mean, what the hell kind of evolutionary benefit is that, right? I mean, it's, obviously it's not. I mean, look around. Obviously, being able to be, psychologically controlled is not helping anybody. Okay, anyway, back to the question. What the hell's the question? Our ancestors. Oh, yeah, why do we not listen to our ancestors? Oh, yeah, anyway, so so we have a serious problem. And actually, the problem really does boil down to a psychological problem at its foundation. And there's no real way around this because this is all based on science. Now, okay, so let's set the stage before we get totally schizo on here. So why do we find ourselves in a position as a society, and once again, just focusing on the West, but why is it that we find ourselves in a position to where when we want to go and learn about our past, right? And I don't just mean your great-great-grandpa's past, although that's a similar problem that we have. I'm talking about your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather's past, right? If you want to go learn about that, where do you even begin? Because the reality is, I'm willing to bet that 99.9% of people on this planet right now don't really truly have any real kind of connection to their ancestor that would go that far back. And by that far back, let's just say 1,000 years. Let's have fun. We'll just set a date. So, I mean, how do you even make a connection like that anyway? Now, some people might say, oh yeah, well, I've got like an heirloom or something. But you really? You have 1,000-year heirloom? Now, that's not impossible, right? And I get that. And there might, like I said, 99.9% people have nothing. But there might be people out there here and there, but they're the minority, who do maybe legitimately have that heirloom. But I would then actually ask those people, how do you know that heirloom is legitimately 1,000 years old? How do you know it? Like, how do you prove something like that? Because as far as you know, maybe your great-great-grandfather was just, trolling the family and just, found some crap on the street and then showed it to his grandkid and was like, yeah, dude, this is from your, 1,000-year-old grandparent. He used to use this rock to hunt. Right, or something like that, right? And then the grandfather goes off and has a good laugh, and then the kid holds on to it, legitimately thinking that it is a 1,000-year-old heirloom. This is one of the problems that we run into. Proof. How do you prove this stuff? Now, it's also one of the inescapable problems that we, all historians have, and it's one of the foundational problems that other malicious bad actors will of course play upon to gain control of certain aspects of this particular, well, all aspects of the historical arena, right? So anyway, but how do you prove that, right? This is the situation we run into. We have no real way of connecting ourselves scientifically to our ancestors, if for no other reason than, the second law of thermodynamics is alive and well. 1,000 years is a long time. Hell, 100 years is a long time. And I know some of you are probably thinking, well, 1,000 years is like nothing. That would be like a uniformitarianism perspective. 1,000 years is a lot of time. Like I said, a decade, hell, you could really, I can make the argument that one day is a huge amount of time. Because think about all the stuff that can happen in just one day. Think about the amount of changes that can happen in one day, right? So if you're willing to play around and throw around, 100 years here or 1,000 years there, and you just throw that around as if it doesn't matter, that is just irresponsible. There's no other way around that. If you are willing to play with time like that, you have already lost the mark. You are already offbeat. You can't do that. It's very important to be able to lock down events precisely, right? I mean, who's going to argue with that, right? That's like the historical wet dream, is to be able, well, I guess maybe more the chronologist wet dream, but anyways, to be able to lock down historical events, factual historical events that legitimately took place, and being able to say that, yes, that event 1,000 years ago took place. We know this for a fact. It's backed up by science, blah, blah, blah. Like, that's the dream. But how often does that really happen? Right? And it never happens. I mean, that's the reality. It does not happen. So one of the first problems that we run into when we ask the question, why is it that we do not trust or believe the stories that our ancestors carried down to us? The first problem is a very simple one, and it's based on common sense, right? It's subconscious common sense. 1,000 years is a long time. If you find yourself in a position to where, say, you are hearing an oral story that was supposed to originate, let's just say 1,000 years ago, common sense really starts to kick in, and you are going to have questions, right? You're going to have some uncertainties, and you should, right? That is good common sense humanity right there. Like, hopefully you have questions, because if somebody starts talking to you about some of these stories and it's 1,000 years ago, and then of course the stories are talking about gods fighting in the sky, or massive earthquakes, or an island sinking, or something like that, you're gonna have some questions, right? And the problem is that when you start to hear these kinds of stories, you're going to look around and you are going to compare those stories with your own personal experiences, and then you're going to try to make the decision on whether or not those stories might be true, in totality, or maybe they're, maybe an embellishment, yeah, my ancestors may have done something, but they're obviously kind of, talking it up, or it's just an outright fictional tale, right? Because, and that of course is going to happen as well, right? There's going to be, and this is one of the things that sucks when it comes to trying to figure out history, is that of course our ancestors back in the day would have been making up stories for entertainment, right? They're human. So of course there's going to be those kinds of things. The problem is, though, is that when you start to look at these things, and if your experience, your day-to-day experience, and you can go a little further and say maybe the scientific experience of the current world you live in, if those experiences are not lining up with what the story is purporting to record, right, it kind of kills the credibility, doesn't it? And that's fair, right? That is completely, like I said, that's a common sense thing. That's you analyzing something and trying to figure out if it's something you should take seriously. So right off the bat, we actually have a huge ingrained inherent issue of history. And that is that, there might actually legitimately be fiction within the histories. All right, that is a possibility, right? Somebody just made up a really cool story, and the tribe, the culture, whatever, wanted to carry it on down, and then God knows what could have happened there, right? In this example that we'll use for this whole talk, 1,000 years ago, let's just say, 1,000 years ago is a long time for stuff to change, and you as a human understand that intrinsically. Subconsciously at least, but more often than not, you're going to understand that consciously. So once you start to hear those stories, and if the story sounds, incredible, like it's too crazy, your average person is going to file that away into the realm of fiction. Now, this is, like I said, this is still more of a Western perspective. The Western mind will file those stories away as a fiction, or as an embellishment that you can't really corroborate. Now, I don't blame anybody for doing that. Right? Like I said, if your experiences, or the greater experiences of what you can see nowadays going on, if those things do not line up with whatever the story might be talking about, I mean, there's no connection, right? Or it's very difficult to make the connection. Then it gets even worse. So, one of the main reasons why you might actually file that away as a fictional event is because what'll happen is that mainstream historians will also corroborate that point of view. Because mainstream history, like, they already have their entire zeitgeist laid out, right? Their chronology is essentially locked down. They are not looking to change the story, right? Those dates are not changing, right? Egyptology is not going to rearrange itself based on any new evidence that will ever be dug up over there in Egypt. And it's true, because we know for a fact that Egyptologists have made other discoveries which really does call into question the current, Egyptology zeitgeist, right? Their chronology is trash, but they're not going to change their chronology. And that goes for pretty much all of history all over this planet. Because the reality is, the Western train of thought, the Western, I don't know, what's a good word for it? Like, the Western overlord of history is essentially taking over everything. And this overlord demands that nothing be changed. And it gets even worse, because what mainstream history also demands is that you have to. It is required. You have to believe what they say. If you do not follow or fall into what they have created relative to the chronology, you are immediately excommunicated from mainstream history, right? I mean, and that's just the reality. So if you grow up in the West, you are taught a very specific history. God knows what you're taught nowadays. I don't even want to imagine what kids are taught nowadays. Jesus. But anyway, you're taught a very specific history, and you're not allowed to question it. And you certainly are not allowed to bring any artifacts up that would challenge it. So what happens is, as we grow up in the Western world, we become accommodated to this very particular authority, knowing from its perspective, but from our perspective, as far as your average person can tell, these people know exactly what they are talking about. Why is that? Because the institution of academia is supposed to be built on intellectual truth. Right? It's supposed to be built on people doing really good research, bringing out the facts, really, critical thinking, and really looking at stuff and applying the scientific method, maybe even. That is how academia is presented to the general populace of the West. And of course, you're getting this indoctrination right from the get-go, right? You're a young kid, you're thrown into school, and this is what you are bombarded with. Of course, you being a kid, this is your formative years for not just physical, but psychological development. So what happens is that message that academia is the know-all, be-all authority, and it's, supposed to be based on truth, that just becomes ingrained in everybody in the West. So what happens is that as you develop, the institution of academia and how it operates, or how it's supposed to operate, becomes chiseled into your brain. So as this gets chiseled into your brain as you grow up, it becomes over time more and more difficult to question that particular authority, because that authority has been made as the ultimate authority with respect to how you look at your society. Right? So, I mean, right here, and everything I'm saying right here is just backed off of really basic psychological science. There's nothing crazy. We're not even into the crazy stuff yet. But this is what happens. So this is why we find ourselves in the West stuck or trying to fight a situation to where you might find or see evidence for something that goes against what the mainstream is saying. And, you look at it and you're like, what, really? And then, you'll go to Wikipedia, you'll go look at some papers, and all of those sources, they corroborate the mainstream chronology. They don't leave any opening for you to take your evidence and maybe try to figure out a different way of approaching the subject. You're not allowed to do that. And in fact, it gets even worse because the exact opposite happens. If you decide that you want to take your ancestors' stories seriously, what happens is that you are confronted with all of this mainstream information that is more than likely false or intrinsically twisted, but it has been immortalized in your society. So, how the hell do you fight against that? Right? Because if you're really going to be alone in a lot of these cases. If you're like, hey, look, I actually do have some evidence that proves that maybe the time frame of something should be shifted or changed entirely, right? You're not allowed to do that because that's not how historians operate. The way historians and archaeologists, by extension, the way they operate now is this. So, like I said earlier, there is already a chronology in the West that has been locked down. The dates are there, the events are there, blah, blah, it's all there, right? You know, you can go right now and see whole nice timelines laid out by historians. And everything looks all nice and neat, right? And that's how they present it, and that's how they've designed it. And that's the effect that it's having on everybody psychologically, right? I mean, it really does look complete. It gives you that kind of a confidence. It projects, you know, a kind of confidence that it's tough to fight against. Anyway, so you see that. But what happens, though, is that since historians have now, in the modern age, they've created this rock-solid timeline, what happens is that you're not allowed to change that timeline because they already know they are right. Now, here's where archaeologists come into play, and they get screwed too. If you're an archaeologist and you go do a dig and you find stuff that legitimately goes against the mainstream chronology, you still, even if you're a Harvard archaeologist and you find objective evidence which would demand something be changed in the mainstream chronology, because you have the physical evidence, right? That's good stuff. If you have the stratigraphic physical evidence of something, right, you know, and it demands that the mainstream chronology be changed, what happens, right? So that archaeologist is not going to present his or her evidence to the mainstream because, well, there's going to be at least two reasons. The first thing that archaeologist is going to do is that archaeologist is going to look at that evidence, and instead of going to the mainstream timeline and to his colleagues, his or her colleagues, and saying, hey, look, guys, we found this is legit, we really need to change some dates because of the finding, they're not going to do that. Why won't they do that? Because they have already been trained to believe in the mainstream chronology. So when an archaeologist discovers something that is, you know, essentially an out-of-place artifact for them, instead of looking at it and being like, hey, you know what, let's rethink this, let's see what we can do to change the timeline using physical evidence, they don't do that. Because they already know for a fact in their brain that mainstream history has already been figured out. So what they do with that artifact is either A, they will brush it to the side and say, oh, it's just some weird anomaly that, you know, fell down a hole and then we dug it up and whatever. It's nothing, right? It's an accident. You know, they throw it to the side, right? And then a collector buys it and then it disappears forever. And that happens more often than you might think. And this is the kind of stuff that just absolutely pisses me off, man. I mean, can you imagine how many artifacts that we have now lost to private collectors, or just through the stupidity of the mainstream historical and archaeological institutions? I mean, these people, they've probably found some of the most amazing stuff that we could have ever imagined, and it's sitting somewhere in the Smithsonian, dated completely incorrectly, or just not dated at all, and it's just sitting there in a crate not doing anything because nobody was brave enough to truly attach a date to it and then champion that date, you know, through science and more archaeology, right? They don't do that. So that's the first problem with archaeologists. The second problem, or the second thing that we have to worry about when it comes to an archaeologist, is that if they find something that goes against the mainstream chronology, what they will then instead do is they will be like, well, you know, I think we can kind of fit it right over here into the chronology and kind of make that work. And then, yeah, we can do that. We can now date it relative to the mainstream because we've essentially forced it into the timeline. And now everybody will believe us because the archaeologist has placated the historian. You know, the reality is the historical timeline, you know, just some garbage somebody writes, for whatever reason, that seems to dictate how archaeology is dated rather than the reverse, right? I mean, and it's insane. It should be the exact opposite. We should be using the findings that people discover, right? All this crazy archaeology, that is what should be driving the creation of the chronology, but it doesn't. It's the exact opposite. The already established chronology drives whatever you're allowed to discover out in the field. And it gets even crazier. You can go and read all kinds of archaeological papers, and some of these papers will, in the abstract, it's hilarious. You read the abstract, and one of the things that the archaeologist will do, they'll say, okay, so we made this discovery, and it really spreads some doubt and really casts a dark shadow on the mainstream chronology, which is kind of showing that the date might be wrong. But hold on, no, I'm not saying it's wrong though, guys. Okay, so please don't fire me. Please don't take my funding away. I'm just saying that I still believe in the mainstream chronology. I just, the evidence. I'm just trying to write a paper of what I found. But please don't fire me, right? And they will literally beg for their jobs in their paper, because an honest archaeologist will run into this problem, right? They'll run into the problem of finding something that goes against the mainstream chronology, but they also know that they cannot fight the mainstream chronology because they are well aware of how the academic institutions operate. Nobody is going to allow you to change the hierarchy of how history is taught. Now, this is obviously a problem because we find ourselves in a situation to where even if you have physical evidence, even if you have the actual scientific evidence to potentially prove that a story happened 1,000 years ago, actually did happen 1,000 years ago, if your evidence or if your story goes against the Western ideologies, you are not allowed to pursue it, or at least the mainstream will not be there to help you, right? The mainstream is not there for you. So this is baffling, right? I mean, this is the situation that we find ourselves in when we are trying to prove what actually happened in the past. So when we ask the question, why do we not believe, generally speaking, the general population doesn't generally believe what their ancestors recorded, this is one of the big reasons why. If you live in the Western world, you have the ultimate authority when it comes to history, telling you and everybody around you that unless you are following what is being taught by them, anything else has to be false. So what this has been doing over the past few hundred years is it has been creating a society full of people that no longer either A, know their history really at all anymore, and B, really have no more desire to learn the real history. And to make matters even worse, in today's day and age, the history is quite literally being rewritten right in front of us. Right here on social media, you can find countless examples of the historical institution, that authority, literally rewriting history. And I don't mean like little details of history. I'm talking like major parts of history, because I'm not quite ready to have the channel banned yet. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but that's a different subject anyways. But anybody with basic critical thinking and basic observational skills can look around what's going on right now in the West, and you can see what's happening. It's right in front of you. The problem is that we now find the Western society has been psychologically conditioned to a point throughout the last few generations to where they will happily accept this kind of psychological programming. In fact, they've actually, it's funny, the psychological programs right now being employed in the Western world, they are so out in the open that sometimes they literally do not even hide the fact that it is psychological conditioning. They will literally say, this is how we're going to change the way you think, right? We are going to change, the normal. We are going to create a new normal. And people realize, they're not dumb, or not everybody, but I mean, a lot of people realize that, yes, that is a psychological change, and they actually go along with it. This is the level, the depth of psychological conditioning that exists in the Western world. It's that insane. Anyway, this psychological conditioning, though, has also created an atmosphere to where people are far less likely, and I don't care who you are, I don't care what race you are, it doesn't matter. If you have been exposed to Western propaganda, and if you're in the Western world, do you have a smartphone? Yeah, you're listening to this on YouTube. You are being exposed to huge amounts of psychological programming. There is no way around that, right? And you're not immune to it. Because you are not immune to this kind of social programming, what has happened, whether you like it or not, is that you have been shaped in a very specific psychological way that is literally designed to make you not only doubt your ancestors' past, but to actually go out of your way to discard anything that was transmitted down from them. This is literally what is going on right now. And I don't say this from just some sort of a schizo-psychotic, breakdown perspective. It's legitimate science, and the programming is right in front of you. Like, the programs are right there. I'm not going to go through and identify some of the programs just because that was not what I kind of originally was going to talk about on this show. But, it's true, man. I know it sounds schizo at first, but, the reality is all you have to literally do is open your eyes and look at your society from a slightly different perspective. If you can pull yourself out and look at yourself and everything going on around you from a third-person perspective, and you can stay objective, the programs pop out almost instantly. So the question of why don't we believe what our ancestors say has several answers, and one of the answers is a malicious one. So all of the programming that I just talked about that's going on right now, this programming has affected the vast majority, and it's affected everybody. I'm not going to say the vast majority. If you live in the Western world, you're affected. It's that simple. I don't know what else to say. But this programming has gone out of its way to disconnect you from your past. Now, you might be asking, why would anybody care about doing that, right? I mean, my example is, 1,000 years ago, we're questioning a story that may have happened. Who cares what happened 1,000 years ago? Like, why would somebody go out of their way to condition out of me a desire to know what happened 1,000 years ago to my ancestors? I mean, it's 1,000 years ago, bro. That's a long time. I agree, it is. So why would somebody do that? I mean, how relevant, the question is legit. How relevant is 1,000-year-old history of your great-grandfather really, how important really is that to you, right? Like, your average person will blow this off naturally even without programming because it's a long time ago. There is a natural psychological disconnect there, and I acknowledge that. And that's one of the issues. We'll get to that next. Because apparently I have no direction for what the hell I'm talking about. But the question should then be asked, why would somebody go out of their way to disconnect me from history that is 1,000 years old? And the answer is simple, and it's very important. If somebody can disconnect you from a past, a very real past, if somebody can disconnect you from having any kind of a foundation of which your ancestors built throughout the centuries, what happens is that the person, you nowadays, you will actually find yourself in a position to where you have a huge empty hole within your psychological makeup. You will find that you are not anchored to something. Now, humans have a natural desire to want to belong. Like it or not, humans are social creatures. We naturally want to be social, right? And when humans get together, they can accomplish all kinds of stuff, can't they? One of the things that humans getting together can accomplish is they can shut down higher levels of authority that are exploiting them. So what's going on is that the higher levels of authority are doing everything they can. And remember, they're doing everything. I mean, it's not just psychological, right? It's chemical, it's physical. I mean, it's insane. But one of the things that you can do is if you can sever a connection to your past, and it doesn't just have to be 1,000 years, any past, all of your past. And ultimately, that is the goal. The goal is to make sure that every single human on this planet does not have a connection to anything in Earth's past. Once you do that, you create a psychological void. What you can then do, if you have the resources, is you can fill that void with something else. You can fill that psychological void with a different kind of programming. And you can choose programming that will ensure that the authoritative institutions stay authoritative. That is exactly what is going on right now. And that is exactly why we do not pay attention to our ancestors' stories anymore. And I don't care how crazy the story is. Right now, you'll find, you can go to your average person, ask them what their family history is. Ask yourself. Here's even a better question. Start with yourself. Ask yourself, how far back does your family history really go? Right? Now, the interesting news on that is that I realize we have the genetic situation going on, and they're building those trees up and everything, and that is fascinating. I don't know what kind of games those companies are playing. I'm not gonna jump to any conclusions. But the reality is, those genealogies only go so far back. And there really is a point to where it becomes increasingly difficult to truly scientifically say that, this is where your ancestors came from, past a certain point, etc. Just because we don't have the scientific information to corroborate it. It's just not there, right? Pictures, for example, of your ancestors didn't really exist, like actual photos, didn't exist until the 1800s. You might be lucky and have maybe some sort of a wood engraving of your great-great-great-great-great-grandfather or whatever. But the odds are you probably don't, because most people were not getting their likenesses engraved, right? It cost money, it took skill, it just wasn't happening. It's not common. So corroborating any of your past is actually extremely difficult. And of course, the further back you go, the harder it's just going to get. Now, this of course raises an entire other question, and that question is, why the hell is it so hard for us to really have good evidence about what was going on just say 400 years ago, right? That's not that long ago. I mean, it's a chunk of time, right? 400 years, that's a lot of time. But the reality is, as humans, why are we missing so much, right? Why are there so many questions? We really should have a much better grasp on our history in general than we do today. And that's a legitimate problem, and I'm not going to get into that here. My main point is to ask yourself, how far back can you truly go to where you feel, from a scientific perspective, that you honestly feel that you have a great grasp on exactly where you came from, right? And most people are going to have nothing ultimately. Some of you are going to be able to track your stuff back a few hundred years, and that's awesome. Like, if you're one of those people, you're a rare one of those people. But the reality is, the further back you go, and it's not that far, suddenly everything starts to get very gray. Of course, that also begs the question as to why, but I'm not going to get into any of that right now. I mean, it's kind of relevant. I don't know. I'm already kind of going crazy with this. Okay, anyway. So one of the reasons why we generally do not tend to believe the further back stories that our ancestors recount. And I'm talking about the 1,000+ year ones, the ones where we have gods fighting in the sky and massive destruction and massive, migrations and death and all the, disease and all this crazy stuff. That when you hear those stories, they sound insane. They just sound like your ancestors were smoking some of the most hardcore crack that my neighbors sell, right? You just go down there, you just pop that pipe open, you just start snorting it before you even light it, and you just lose your mind. But that's what they may have been doing, right? That's what you think, because their stories are so crazy. Which brings us up to the other problem, of course, with respect to why we don't believe them. And that problem would be the fantastical nature of a lot of our histories. Now, I get it, not all history is insane and crazy. There's going to be a lot of our history that's recounted, it's very normal, relatively speaking. But the problem is that a lot of the histories, they're not just full of normal stuff. The problem is most histories, not even most, realistically all of them, all of our ancestors' histories are punctuated with just these absolutely insane stories. To make matters even weirder for the person listening to these historical recountings is that these stories are not told from a perspective of entertainment or fiction. Right, when a shaman starts recounting what was going on in North America, for example, from one of the various tribes, I don't even know if there's any more North American Indian shamans left that actually hold true to any of the original oral tales. It sucks, man, because anyway, different subject. The point here is that when you start to listen to those people, these people are not telling a story as if it's just some sort of grand adventure and it's fake. These stories are told from a perspective of reality. I'll stick with an example from North American Indians, but when you start to listen to their history, if you go and you read a book about it or something like that, it sounds crazy to the modern mindset, right? Because we have Raven doing this, we have Raven lifting up mountains, and we have Crow doing that, and we have Eagle going over here, Snake is doing this, Turtle is, it's crazy at first, right? You're from a Western perspective, these kind of stories sound insane. And so your average person, even if you weren't really necessarily conditioned to hate on your past, it still challenges incredulity. It really does, right? You're going to tell me that Raven flipped over the earth and built up one of the mountain chains? What are you talking about, man? That's crazy. And from today's perspective, and it doesn't matter who you are, it sounds extra crazy because everybody nowadays believes that they know how mountains are really built. Right? The mainstream believes in the tectonic situation. They honestly believe. And of course, just like the historical institutions, the scientific institutions are not allowed to be questioned either. So we all grew up with, the whole tectonic plate thing. And so we all know for a fact that mountains grow very, very slowly over billions of years. A mountain was not created by Raven flipping over the planet. That's not possible. It's ridiculous, right? That is the modern mindset. So what we find ourselves in, the kind of position that we find ourselves in today's day and age, is one to where we have been trained to no longer even consider what our ancestors used to talk about, not just because historians demand our complete loyalty, but because science does as well. And I mean mainstream science, not real science, mainstream science. Mainstream science commits the exact same crimes that the historical institutions do, right? The mainstream scientific realm, you either believe in dark matter and dark energy, or you're the crazy one, right? You either believe in uniformitarianism, or you're the conspiracy theorist, right? And you can't question it. And so we all grew up with that, so nobody does. Or I should say the vast majority of people don't. And they also don't just because most people don't care, right? Most people on this planet do not care where mountains came from. So when they hear somebody from an Indian tribe say, Raven did this or that, and then they built the mountain ranges, you're just like, all right, bro, okay, all right, I'm just gonna go now, okay. And you move on, right? Nobody cares. That's the level of disconnect that we have now in our society at a psychological level. It is absolutely insane. So the problem, how do you even solve this problem, right? If the vast majority of people have now been convinced that any story being recounted by our ancestors must be crazy fiction, how are we ever supposed to figure out real history? And then even more important, how are we supposed to maintain a connection to our past? Right? It's all being severed. I mean, I mean, I don't know what to tell you. You just want to. Okay, I'm calming down. Am I ranting? What am I talking about? Why? That's why we don't. That's like those are the main reasons nowadays why we do not trust the histories that our ancestors carry down. And of course, to make matters even worse, right? You know, the mainstream, they go out of their way to demonize anybody who wants to try to believe any of those old stories, right? Oh, the old stories are just crazy. You're stupid if you want to believe that, right? And they've torn apart cultures. Like I was kind of alluding to the North American Indian shaman situation. I don't know how bad it is nowadays, but if you just go back into like the 30s and 40s, you can find interviews with the shamans who would carry on down the oral traditions, and they're very specific, and they say nobody wants to keep this going. None of the children, none of the tribe's kids, they don't care about the oral traditions, right? They're into modern society. They're not interested in carrying on those stories. And to make matters worse, modern society, of course, makes those stories look even more ridiculous. So the problem just compounds itself. Can you imagine what what the historical landscape is going to look like 200 years from now, when all of us are dead? You know, the internet is completely 100% controlled by, you know, a very central area, and the internet is that central area is what's going to be, you know, producing the historical content. I mean, it's going to be insane, right? The lies, the amount of data that will not be available to all of our future ancestors. We call them that, to our future progeny or whatever. Like, they're not going to have a clue. They're going to have no connection to anything in the past, and they're not even going to have an attempt to not believe it, because it won't even be presented to them. They won't even have the opportunity to potentially make the decision for themselves whether they believe the stories or not. That's where we're heading. I mean, we're screwed. Okay, anyway, I'm just like blabbing now. You see what I'm saying though? But these are the problems. These are the reasons why most people do not take these stories seriously anymore. So, I mean, all this blabbing, my main thing, which I should have just said in the first 30 seconds of the show and just, you know, cut the video. The point is that we have to be careful. We have to be mindful of what is going on around us. Not only are we against the second law of thermodynamics, right? As historians, as chronologists, we already have a mountain of natural problems, right? Things happened a long time ago. We had to figure that out, and we have very little to work with, right? So that's already bad enough. And now now we find ourselves being attacked by historical authoritative institutions, and of course, even the main scientific authoritative institutions. They are not interested in the truth either. So this is what we have to go against, right? It's funny, I can't even say certain things on this channel because my channel would be immediately deleted, because the truth is not what society is truly looking for. Or I should say the authorities that run society right now, they're not interested in that. So there's your scientific proof, by the way, that that you're being lied to by the mainstream institutions, right? You can't even approach certain subjects in our day and age without being absolutely dogpiled on, without absolutely being destroyed socially. And hell, you'd probably be assassinated too if you go too far, right? I mean, it's like, okay, I gotta calm down. All right, so you see what I'm saying? This is our problem. This is what we have to be mindful of when we are learning and trying to figure out the histories. So my main point, I guess, is to not discard oral traditions. Do not discard histories that are just older, right? These things are important. I guess ultimately one of the main reasons why I wanted to say all of this garbage was because on this channel I do want to be able to look at oral tradition and other kinds of histories that initially might sound insane, but I want to look at them and take them seriously, because what we are finding is that these stories legitimately have real events chronicled. I mean, they're there. When somebody says that the gods are fighting up in the sky, instead of hand waving them away like some sort of cringe lord atheist, listen to what they are saying with respect to those gods. Because once, and like I said on this channel, for example, once we hear the word God, if we replace the word God with planet, suddenly history has a completely different meaning. So it's important to be able to look at histories, which you may have discarded because it sounded fantastical. But you know what? On the other hand, there might actually be a lot of real scientific data in there. You just have to learn how to interpret what they're saying. And maybe even interpret is not even the word I should use. You just need to learn what they're talking about. You have to listen to them, right? So when, like I said, the ancestors, they literally say the gods up in space and the sky. Space exists, and they have relegated, the names of the gods to planets. We know planets exist. Scientifically, I just proved that you can take ancient histories then, and you can actually read them and listen to them on a scientific basis and get something out of them and actually maybe produce a real understanding of history. Right? That is why, that's my main point, right? Just don't discard all of these histories. They are extremely important. We need to be able to take even the most insane sounding history seriously. All right, I'm done. I know. Look, I know. I probably won't even. Oh, you know what? I'm gonna put this on the channel just to troll myself because of how crappy this whole talk was. All right, I'm gonna go. I need food.